All right, rather than deal with a zoom for our snow day, let's just take a look at the beginning of China and the history of China. And we'll go through a couple of things real quick, and I'll post this up. And then I'll have you maybe watch another little quick video about the beginning of China as well. That way, when we come back, if we get to come back, if the snow melts before then, we will take a look at the religions and philosophies of China a little bit later on with Confucianism, Taoism, legalism. But right now, we're going to take a look at these two things. The food that developed in China, regional differences, and the elements of Chinese civilization that took shape between 1200 and 221 BC. When we talk about China, the beginning of China, remember that China is the last of our great river civilizations. We've talked about Egypt, Mesopotamia, India. Now we're going to talk about China. And it's the last of our great river civilizations. It's going to develop here along the Yellow River and the Yangtze. So Neolithic China is a time period where this area and this area really become important. The Yellow River and down here in the Yangtze, they are very different agriculturally. And depending on the geography of China, you can get a lot of different products that are produced up here versus what's produced down here. So we know that Neolithic agriculture in China dates back, and it depends on who you talk to. Some say by about 5000 BCE, but recent excavations and some archaeological evidence wants to push that date back to well before 6000 BCE. So we know that this area had agriculture for quite some time before civilization took root here. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. But when you get to really what happens in China, there are probably really three separate zones in China. Northern China, which does not get as much rain, for example, as southern China does. That means that up here, different crops are going to grow than they are down here in southern China. Mostly it is wheat and grains that are grown in the north, but in the more monsoonish southern China area where it gets so much more rainfall, then you're going to see rice. Silk is going to be a major agricultural product. Yes, silk is an agricultural product produced by silkworms. So silk will be in the Yangtze area by about 4500 BC. Using jade for decorative items by about 3000 BC. But Bronze Age China does not happen until you get to the Shang period, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. That you don't really get to Bronze Age China until you get to about 1800 or so BCE. For a while, we used to think that the Shang period was the beginnings really of civilization in China. That everything up to and prior to the Shang period was Neolithic. You see Neolithic pottery like this, but nobody really believed that civilization developed in China any time before the Shang period. Today, there is an effort to claim that civilization in China should be pushed back and made earlier to an earlier period called the Xia period, or the Xia dynasty, which would put civilization in China beginning a little bit before 2200 BC. Most scholars disagree with this. Most scholars outside of China perhaps, really believe that the Xia dynasty is nothing more than Neolithic China. Now, true, they may have been very advanced. They probably were ruled over by kings. They probably had some very distinct organization. They may have pushed the boundaries of civilization. But one of the biggest things that's missing in this period is writing. And so Chinese writing will not develop until the Shang period. But this period, this Shang period, is really kind of shrouded in mystery. It probably is where many of the creation myths in China begin. It probably is associated with legends in China like the Three Wise Kings. Some of the Shah dynasty, supposed Shah dynasty kings were these three legendary kings that gave order to the universe and separated the water from the land and did flood control and writing and things like that. But that doesn't happen. But it's a period of time that we have to examine, and it probably is Neolithic China. Very advanced, but Neolithic China. They probably by this time had some government organization like kings, but they don't make it all the way to civilization. So when you see Shah dynasty kings like Yu the Great, all right, that's probably some of these legends that date back into the Shah dynasty, and these legends about the Three Wise Kings. They're great stories, but they're probably not rooted in fact. Okay, so Fuxi, Huangdi, Yu, others, one of these kings that are supposedly part of the Shah dynasty, they may not really have existed. What we do know, though, is that the Shang dynasty is this period of time when civilization in China really begins. And what we know about the Shang dynasty is pretty straightforward. The Shang probably moved in, conquered these areas, probably conquered the people of the Shah dynasty too, and set up really a Bronze Age empire, kingdom, if you will, here in China. Notice it's still around the Yellow River here in the Yangtze. Okay, it's still this area right over in here. This is the period of time when, like we said, the Shang are going to produce writing about 1200 or so BC. Okay, the Shang had some pretty simple religious beliefs. The Chinese had developed really a religion that talked about gods, that talked about heaven and things like that, but they also worshiped their ancestors, and that became a pretty strong thing during the Shang period of time. They asked their ancestors to intercede for them, to help them, offering them gifts and hoping that they would help them in their current life. The Shang were very strongly ruled over by a king, okay, and even some of the first records of the Shang dynasty dating back to that period of time talk about the power of the kings. They were extremely powerful. They were worshipped. When a king died, he would be entombed, and all of his staff would be beheaded and placed in the tomb with him to serve him in the afterlife. So it's a very brutal period of human sacrifice. The Shang kings were extremely powerful. They used bronze really not only as a weapon, but also they kept it a very closely guarded secret to give them military power in the area. The Shang were, like we said, expanding out into a lot of these areas. The writing is by far the most important thing that comes out of this period. One of the best examples, some of the early examples, are things like this, oracle bones. And these are the Chinese characters that date back to the oracle bones. And what you did was you wrote on it, you asked questions, and you threw the bones in the fire, and they would crack. And then you, like this crack that runs right through here, and you could then get your answers, tell the future, but depending on how the cracks developed. So here's another example of an oracle bone calendar. Like any of the pictographs that we talked about early on, okay, it evolves, okay, and Chinese writing will evolve during this period and to what it is today. But you can see early on, as this one that represents a horse does, you can kind of see that that's a horse, and that's what it's supposed to be. But it will evolve and change. So this is some examples. So you go all the way back to oracle bone Chinese, and you can see it's very pictographic. But then it will evolve and change into a much more symbolic language. One of the biggest problems China will face later on is that as more and more people kind of spread out into China, regional dialects became a big deal. We have dialects here, and I mean, we in the South talk much different than people like in Boston, for example. And so while we say dog, they would say dag. All right, it's still the same furry thing. But those regional differences over time can become very difficult to someone not familiar with the dialect. Well, over time in China, the dialects really became so bad and so different from one another, it was like speaking a different language. But written Chinese will become standardized. And so no matter how you pronounced dag or dog, you would still use the same symbol for dog. And so the message never got lost. The standardization, really, of Chinese script later on is going to be a big deal. And it helps these regions communicate with each other, even if they can't speak to one another and understand. So here's another example of an oracle bone. Okay, and you would ask your ancestors, or you would ask someone to help you, and you would write the questions on there, and then throw the bone into the fire, and it would crack, and it would reveal the answer. The other thing is that bronze, like we said during the Shang period, was used not only for war, but also for these different sort of bronze items, including some artistic bronze like this. Okay. Jade was also a big part of Chinese culture during that period as well. So here's a Shang urn, for example, and you can see how intricate some of this bronze work really is. Well, then we get to our first real crisis. Okay? The Shang period will come to an end when the Shang are invaded and conquered by another group called the Zhou. And I know that looks like Z-H-O-U, and it is, but you pronounce ZHs in Chinese. When we kind of take it out of Chinese, you pronounce it like a J. And so this is the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty will move in and conquer the Shang. The last Shang kings were terrible. They were awful rulers. And Chinese, really civilization was really falling apart because of that poor leadership. And so, that's that's going to happen when you have poor leadership. So when the Zhou moved in and conquered the Shang kings, despite how terrible they were, we had to have an explanation. And when the Zhou dynasty overthrew the Shang, they come up with an explanation simply called the Mandate of Heaven. This will become the Zhou. And by the way, you can write it this way, or you can write it this way. You still pronounce it Zhou. When you try to explain this, the Zhou came up with an explanation for the Chinese people because the king was supposed to make sure that everything was harmonious. And the kings had the favor of heaven because they oversaw the cycles of life and the harmony, very similar to what we talked about with Egypt. The leader, according to the new Zhou rulers, had to lead by ability, had to be a good leader. That's what kept everything harmonious. The dynasty's leadership must be justified constantly by succeeding generations of rulers. In other words, you can't just have one good ruler that starts it all and then everybody sort of just lives off that goodwill. Every ruler has to justify himself, show himself approved by heaven. If you have bad rulers, then heaven can withdraw its support of the ruler, and the people could then overthrow that ruler and replace that ruler with a ruler that would. And so the Zhou explain, look, we're here to because your rulers were terrible and we've overthrown them. Now we are going to bring about reform and structure and order, and everything's going to get better, and that's a sign that heaven approves us. It's a great explanation, but the mandate of heaven becomes a pretty big deal. Okay, now the Zhou period is broken down into these three big periods. Okay, the Western Zhou, the Eastern Zhou, and then the later Zhou period, which leads us right into the Warring States period. Okay, this later Zhou period is part of the Warring States period, where essentially China devolves into a civil war. It's a period of time. It's also the Iron Age in China. Okay, and we've moved out of bronze into the Iron Age. The Zhou leaders decide that they're going to rule a little bit differently than the Shang kings. The Shang kings had been very centralized. Everything ran through the king. The Zhou decide instead that they are going to decentralize China. The emperor is only going to be responsible for the little area essentially around the palace. Everything else is going to be ruled over by regional governors who are going to be responsible to the king. Now, that decentralized approach sounds good, because out in the provinces you have rulers that actually understand the provinces, make decisions that are better for the provinces, because they know the people and they know what they can do, things like that. But over time, this is going to lead to factionalization. It's going to lead to the states becoming much more independent, leaders of the states growing more and more independent, and eventually it's going to devolve into a civil war, and that's going to give us the Warring States period that you saw earlier on. So by the way, you've seen this before. And this is kind of going to be the cycle of life in China for a while. When we talk about these dynastic cycles, it's just how they usually run, no matter who we talk about. You have a new dynasty that comes to power. The new king, or later the emperor, reforms the government, makes it more efficient, and everything looks good. The people's lives improve. Okay, but then you have problems that begin. To solve those problems, you need more taxes or more men in the army. Then you have a corrupt government. You usually then, of course, have some sort of natural disaster that happens that reveals the weaknesses of that corrupt government. They lose respect, and these rebels decide to unite and defeat the king, or later the emperor, and it all starts over again. And that's what the Zhou had done. It's also what's going to happen to get rid of the Zhou later on. Again, this is a period of time where a lot of these things are happening, but it's also, this Zhou period is also the biggest part of the development of some of the Chinese philosophies. And the most important ones are developing during this period of time. Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism are the three most important, okay? And Confucius is kind of this almost mythological figure who talks about the way to avoid disaster. In other words, the way that we cannot have to fight this warring states period, is to go back to order and harmony and social harmony. And really what he talked about was rebuilding Chinese society based on honoring these great relationships. You should honor your father. You should honor your ruler. You should, you need to go back to being ethics and being gentlemen. Okay. And Confucius believed that would help bring order to society, and it would help avoid the coming warring states period. Taoism is a little bit different. It says we need to get back in touch with nature. We've gone away from nature, and that's why we're having all these problems. No matter what, okay, whether it's Confucianism or Taoism, the writing's on the wall that the Zhou period is almost over. And what's going to happen is one of those states I told you about, which is called the Qin state. Yes, I know it's written with a Q, and in Chinese you will pronounce it CH, so that is the Qin state. Okay, the Qin are going to adopt legalism, which turns the Qin state into a military powerhouse. They are going to, everybody's either a farmer or a soldier, a very punitive law code, and they are going to essentially become a military state. And once the Qin state becomes a military state, it's going to use that military to conquer the other states, and it will eventually unify China. And we have the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, will be the first emperor and will rule from 221 until 210. All right, and Qin Shi Huangdi is always referred to as the first emperor, but also a very powerful and very brutal ruler as well. And we'll talk about him a little bit later on. Now, in our next sort of talk, though, okay, I'm going to go back and I'm going to take some time out, and we're going to go and talk a little bit about Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism and see how they fit in before we talk about Emperor Qin. We'll do that next time. All right, be safe over the spring, or over the snow day, excuse me. And hopefully we'll see you guys on Wednesday.